My name is Lucia D'Ambrosio. I'm a senior lecturer in global health and associate director of the Centre for Health Data Science in the School of Medicine here in the University of Aberdeen. And I'm really thrilled to introduce this session as part of our 2020 seminar series. And we're going to ask, what does follow the science really mean in the COVID-19 pandemic? We'll explore in this session relationships between evidence and policy in this global public health emergency. Rather than a discussion on what should be done about COVID, we will explore how decisions are made, by whom, and on what basis. And that will help us think through our expectations and assumptions about what hope and policy are. And from which we'll be able to think about the roles of universities and public institutions in pandemic preparedness and response. We're joined by two highly distinguished guests today. Firstly, Professor Agnes Binagwaho joins us from Kigali in Rwanda. Prof. Agnes is a Rwandan paediatrician who returned to Rwanda following the genocide in the late 1990s and supported the health system both through clinical practice and in senior government positions. She worked as Executive Secretary of Rwanda's National AIDS Control Commission, then as Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Health, and for 5 years as Minister of Health. She's now Vice-Chancellor of the University of Global Health Equity in the rural north of the country, and is co-founder of this unique institution training global health professionals. She serves as Senior Advisor to the Director General of the World Health Organization, is Senior Lecturer at the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard, a Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Global Health Equity, a member of the US National Academy of Medicine, and a Fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. Prof. Agnes is a global leader in evidence-based decision-making. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by Professor Paul Kearney from the University of Stirling here in Scotland. Professor Kearney is an internationally renowned specialist in politics and public policy, whose work has brought us new understandings from policy studies to explain the use of evidence in politics and policy, and how policymakers translate long-term aims into evidence-informed objectives. He's worked, among other things, on the role of Scottish institutions in the lead-up to our independence referendum here in Scotland, and also works regionally to build new understandings of how governments can and should use evidence to learn from policy successes and failures. Paul has published widely, writing 2 new books this year and last on understanding complexities of public policy and on the difficulties around preventative health policies. And the latter provides new evidence and insights into what happens when governments make commitments without necessarily knowing how to implement them. Thank you, Paul, for helping us to shape this seminar and for joining us today.
Oh, thank you.
And finally, our chair for the discussion will be at the University of Aberdeen, our Principal and Vice-Chancellor, Professor George Boyne. Professor Bowen has led our university since 2018 and, among many other things, has reoriented us to our 1495 founding principle, in which we are, quote, open to all, dedicated to the pursuit of truth in service of others. And rooted in this purpose, Professor Bowen has encouraged staff and students across the university to come together and develop an ambitious 20-year strategy codifying these values into our future plans. And this was a plan launched this year as we celebrated our 525th anniversary. A world expert on performance in the public sector, Professor Boyne is leading our university in bold and new directions based on values of equity, inclusion and participation. I'm very grateful to him for taking time to chair our discussion today. So thank you, and over to you, Principal.
Thanks, Lucia. As anyone with an interest in this topic will know, there is a long-standing academic literature on evidence-based policymaking stretching back at least 50 years, so in some ways we know quite a lot about it. And certainly it's also true that governments seek to be informed by evidence, sometimes seek to justify or legitimate their policies on the basis of evidence produced by academics and others. So the first part of our conversation today is going to be about the record on evidence-based policymaking, the record on follow the science. What is the evidence on evidence-based policymaking? First of all, I'm going to turn to Paul to talk about the record in the UK.
Oh, put the mic on. So in terms of my experience, it is largely academic. You know, to sum up, you know, what we know from studies of policymaking, use of evidence, and you know, you can boil down, I think, lessons on the use of evidence into two main messages. You know, first is policymakers have to ignore almost all evidence to make choices. You know, because information is infinite and their capacity is finite. And they exist within a policy process that they struggle to understand and have limited control over. So, I mean, I suppose for a long time I was carrying along with those assumptions with minimal interest. But there has been this really growing interest among academics in terms of the relationship between evidence and policy. And it tends to be around this kind of question, why don't policymakers listen to my evidence, or why do they ignore my evidence? And it tends to be expressed most strongly by people within health and public health and you know, climate science who would say they think they have very high quality evidence and they're just not sure why policymakers wouldn't do more about it. So usually I think the answer would be in terms of three categories. The first is, you know, people think of the evidence in very different ways, and that includes policymakers. So often when people wonder why people ignore evidence, it's a particular form of evidence, you know, at top of a notional hierarchy. You know, they mean, you know, why do they ignore trial evidence or randomized control trial evidence? And, you know, most people have this kind of wider sense of what evidence counts within politics and policymaking. The second would be that, again, they have to ignore most of it, so they have to find ways to act efficiently. So that is, you know, setting goals, relying on a small group of experts or sources, and using their gut and emotion to understand problems quickly. And the third thing, I think, is the biggest contribution of policy studies, which is to say, if you understand the environment in which people make these choices, you can understand the role of evidence within them. So I'd break that down to five things quickly. You would say there are many policymakers and influencers spread across governments. You know, there's not one single centre. Each of these venues has its own rules and understandings of policymaking. Each of these venues has its own networks between policymakers and influencers. They talk about sort of dominant ideas or beliefs about policy problems, and they're all responding in different ways to different socioeconomic conditions. So it's not surprising that people are frustrated with the lack of relationship between evidence and policymaking, because it's not clear what policymaking is or how it works, and therefore the relationship between policymaking and evidence will always be unclear. So usually, you know, I like to end with a kind of positive message, which is, you know, if you feel frustrated by that process, it's because it has to be frustrating and lack understanding, because it's so complex. You know, it's not a failing of individuals.
Oh, you are on mute.
Apologies, that's two in a row we've been on mute. Thanks, Paul. That got us off to a really great start. Agnes, how are you seeing this from your perspective?
So from my perspective, I'm a little bit more radical on the role of science. Maybe because I'm a scientist myself who have been drawn to government position, but also just because in Rwanda we are like that. So in Rwanda, since the mid-90s, the government focused its development on human development, because we don't have a lot of, our richest is the people. We don't have gold and many other things like that can pay for things. So we need to base our development on human. And to do that, when you don't have money and you are poor like we are, we cannot do that without knowing our contextual factors. And what happened, because the government used to plan having a plan that all other sectors are obliged to follow. Because this plan is not made by the cabinet per se, it's made starting at district level and come through the local government to the rest of the government. Everybody at all levels have some duty to do during the year, some commitment with true indicators. And for this, we need to know where we come from and where we want to go, what will be the step along the year, and what will be the budget. People who take leadership position take commitment to do that. And having evidence-based decision allow us to make each and everyone accountable to the step, to the achievement, to, of course, we can have unexpected issues like COVID that take out a portion of the budget, etc., but it's explained with evidence. So we take pride of making strong reduction in like under 5 mortality, maternal mortality, other indicators like universal access to HIV, where we do even better than other very developed country or place like New York, just because we use the science, and not the science only of the demographic and health survey, etc. But the last medicine, what it takes, what are the side effects, and make sure that we have economy of scales by have strong protocol with the cheapest way to produce the same effect, and not make the maximum with the money you have. So this progress is the result of building a strong health sector, even in the middle of having nothing, and also based on primary care and how even without having per now birth registry, make sure that everybody has a health insurance. And this process of evidence-based decision using science, whatever science you need, your plan, you have to say where it comes from. What are the evidence you use? And you have to reference your plan like you reference a peer review article. And you are accountable to it. And without evidence-based, without all those steps that are evidence with research, without knowing your contextual factors, what are the best suitable implementation strategy for the best implementation outcome? What is really implementation science? Evidence-based approach. You will not have the result we have here in Rwanda with $800 per capita, exactly 826, and we will not have create a health sector that can manage as we manage today the COVID pandemic. So evidence-based, yes. Using scientific evidence, absolutely. And all the politicians are educated, so they know what research should be, and they should do the best for their people, and working together and having silo where everybody thinks by their own and doesn't come together, harm your people. So I'm for evidence-based approach, basing on science, and this is my story.
Thank you. That's been really helpful. You've set out two quite contrasting approaches to the use of evidence in policymaking. I'm characterizing a lot here and simplifying a huge amount, but I think, Agnes, you've portrayed something which is rationalist and planned and quite heavily reliant on science, whereas, Paul, in the UK, it sounds a bit more, chaotic and political, and as if we're muddling through more than planning that, use of evidence. Lucia, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. I thought I'd give a brief overview of some research I've been involved in from both the global south and north. This is from work in South Africa and how it's reformed, some work recently in Scotland responding to COVID. So in South Africa, I've been very privileged to have worked for the last decade up in the rural northeast with a unique group who've supported the health system post-apartheid over 25 years, building data systems to inform policy. And for several years, this is pre-COVID, and working closely with South African scientists, we developed something called learning platforms. And they bring local service users and providers together to combine the core statistical data from the South African Centre with community knowledge on the realities of service delivery and priorities of local communities. And this helps us understand how systems come together as a whole, from different perspectives, how they can adapt and how they can meet rapidly changing needs. And through that, we have supported the uptake of evidence into health services, albeit at a relatively local and operational level. It's taken time to build those relationships, even in such a supportive research environment. Communities told us, for example, that a main priority was lack of clean, safe water. And while this is fundamental for health, the health system actually has very little direct responsibility for water. So we immediately had to expand into multi-sectoral collectives. And that's been challenging. There are deep divisions between people and the authorities in this area. But we've persevered, and over time the process has been well received. Both government and policy stakeholders report positive shifts towards unifying sustainable partnerships to solve complex and quite deeply entrenched problems. And the learning platform, actually just in the months before COVID and lockdown in South Africa, it was taken up and introduced in the province and district. So we hope it'll be well placed to support the development of multi-agency, community-led responses as COVID progresses in South Africa. At the same time as the pandemic hit in the UK in March, in the Centre for Health Data Science at Aberdeen, this is a research group with long-standing relationships with the Scottish Health Service. We recognise that this kind of cooperative learning approach could support frontline practitioners, planners and managers who were basically operating in the dark without any evidence of what works to deal with a novel virus. And we rapidly stood up multidisciplinary teams, epidemiologists, social scientists, data scientists, to work directly in step with practitioners, collating and providing data and evidence in real time to support the response. Now, as our situation moves into something of its next phase here in Scotland, we're consolidating this whole systems learning as an affirmative approach to recovery that supports effective local implementation, which is critical for outbreak preparedness and response. And we're now working with at-risk groups to understand vulnerability to COVID in the city and the surrounding rural areas. We're developing community engagement strategies to support new activities like contact tracing. And in a similar sense to the work in South Africa, we're connecting communities with different public service providers through the research process to inform and co-produce practical responses. And I think these experiences suggest that in situations of complexity and uncertainty, policy can be usefully informed by knowledge on the ground, from the perspectives of those providing and using services. It can promote communication, accountability, trust, and that in turn informs, supports and strengthens the response. The work here in Scotland has been deeply informed by approaches to public health research from rural South Africa, and we hope to continue exchanging internationally, building these data-driven, inclusive decision-making processes with the most vulnerable populations as an ethical response to the pandemic. But this kind of action research and implementation science is often seen as less scientific or less robust. So we need thought leaders to support these approaches for rapid decision making where local intelligence is important.
Thanks, Lucia. I think you've done exactly what you just recommended that others should do, which is to put forward a strong case for that style of research and how it's able to inform policymaking, which takes us nicely onto our second topic. Of course, we're considering and reflecting upon evidence-based policymaking during a global pandemic, which shines a much stronger light on all of these issues and gives extra urgency to be able to do this effectively and do it well, serving the interests of people who are affected by the pandemic. So the next topic we're coming on to is, in this time of COVID, how could we improve evidence-based policymaking and perhaps take a stronger approach to feeding science into policymaking and into better decisions that better serve the public? So Agnes, I'm going to come to you first for thoughts about all of this, including how universities are able to support this activity.
Thank you. It's a crucial question, knowing that, you know, it's not in the middle of a war that we start building an army. But what we can do now is accountability. You know, what I was saying, how a government should work, you taking decision based on evidence, so that we know where we come from, what we want to do, and what exists out there. Doing your homework, like desk review, what exists out there, what we can do. We should do that now and more than ever, because we all face an epidemic that is a pandemic that is new, where we learn new things every day. So we need to have people who learn every day what is new and how we can apply, but make people accountable on not doing their job. When you have a politician who just ignore what the science has proven to be right and true and need to be done, and just pass through it without being accountable, when there are thousands of people who will die, it's not just. We should bring them, that's my point of view, we should bring them to tribunal for accountability. They had solution to do differently, they didn't did it, they have to explain why. So what to do is to use science. We have scientific all around us, and politicians should take them in account and take decision accordingly, and we can do that. So what to do now in between crisis is to educate politicians. And I'm going to tell you a story that is personal. When I was permanent secretary and even in the National AIDS Control Commission, and after when I was minister, I put all my directors at master program to make sure that they cannot tell me I don't understand the numbers, to make sure that they advise me properly. They just have to sign a retention contract for 4 years after completion. But I had people that can really advise me using science. Why not to do that as a base of governance? Because we don't govern for us, we govern for the people. And when we do it badly, people are dying and we are accountable. So accountability should be the first. Using the science of the day should be the second. And who refuse it should be answerable to that. Now, the role of universities is to do the research that help the leaders to do better or to do right. And as we just hear, implementation science is the avenue for that. If the world today was using all the science known to take decision, we will already save so many people, so many lives. And the other thing is to have an equity lens. Whatever you do, think about how you are going to involve the most vulnerable and not increase inequity. And this is, you can do that using research. Again, produce scientific results that has to be used for decision making. And this can be done immediately if politicians were accountable.
Thank you. Lots of absolutely fascinating points in there. Without wishing to be provocative, do you see across the world politicians being more accountable in some countries than others?
I see countries where there is no accountability. I can say as politician, I want today all the people learning that the earth is flat, that the earth doesn't turn around the sun and the sun turn around, and pass through that. What is not acceptable? This is not democracy, you know. A democracy is at service of people, not at service of strange brain who do what they want. So I think we should redefine what democracy is, to oblige leaders to use science to take decisions so that they help people and they don't pull them down.
Thank you. So normally in a democracy, there are elections every 4 or 5 years. In the absence of an imminent election, how would you suggest that politicians should be held accountable for using the science or not using the science?
You know, are we sure that if we put them in front of international tribunal, they will not be answerable? If me as a leader, I give harm to people, arms now, to kill others directly, I will be accountable in international tribunal. And those people with mismanagement and refusing science are killing more and just pass through it.
Thank you. You're making some very powerful and entirely reasonable points there. Thank you very much. Paul?
Well, I'm not sure what to say. I think we began with this distinction between rationalist approaches and I'd say complexity approaches, and I think I wouldn't see those as distinctions between the UK and Rwanda or other countries. I would say there are differences in perspectives. That a rationalist approach is something that we require to turn what we want to do into policies. A complexity approach is a description of what happens when you try to do that, and a description of the inevitable failure. And so for me, that really informs the ways in which we think about accountability, because if you accept that people can only understand so much of the world and they have so much control over it, then it's hard to hold them to account for everything that goes on, as in the UK system, where ministers are essentially responsible for everything that goes on in their departments. Now, I think when I describe that, I'm describing something different from Agnes, who I think is describing people who are, just individually not doing their jobs correctly. And I think those are different things, aren't they? Holding individuals to account for their behaviour and holding governments to account in a wider sense in terms of their capacity. I mean, the other thing that struck me was there are lots of different models that you can call evidence-informed or evidence-based policymaking. And I think I've heard two of them described in the discussion so far. So I think one of them is a relatively hierarchical system in which there are very clearly defined or narrowly defined notions of what counts as evidence, and it's scientific evidence. And you deliver policy from the centre, because if you know what the problem is and you know what the evidence is on how to do it, then you roll this out sometimes uniformly. I think that's one model that I think lots of researchers have in mind in the UK when they wonder why people don't pay attention to their evidence. It's a very kind of, there's one good body of evidence and we should do the same thing with it. Now, I think the alternative is, I think the sort of thing that Lucia was describing, which is much more local, based on governance principles, based on respect for different forms of knowledge, and not simply scientific knowledge, and thinking about how people give meaning to particular policy problems and how they emphasizing cooperation. And I think the interesting thing there is you can have two very consistent models of evidence-informed policymaking, but in lots of ways they contradict each other. So for example, one of them is relying on a very small group of experts. With the other model, it would be relying on as many people as you can to give you knowledge. One of them is, roll it out from the centre as much as you can to localities and stakeholders. And each of them are fine, I think. They present different implications for how you judge success and how you hold people to account. So in the more stakeholder one, say the UK central government pursued the more localism, more stakeholder involvement, more voices, it would be very difficult to envisage holding them to account for what happened, because at the start they had essentially signalled that they would not be responsible for what happened. So you would essentially only hold them to account for the initial choice that they made there. So I mean, at the risk of waffling a bit, I mean, I think the final thing I would say on the UK is that its response to COVID, I think, has been relatively centralist and based on narrow scientific principles. So in a very narrow sense, it has followed the science very, almost to the letter, because what that means is they've relied on a very small group of scientists and scientific bodies who have given them advice that they have followed quite consistently, at least in the rush up to lockdown. So I think in those terms about who's going to the tribunals, I'd say the UK government ministers, I think have almost nothing to worry about in those terms we've described, because they have followed their scientific advisors, almost to the letter in the run up to the lockdown.
Thanks. That's a fascinatingly different perspective on this and full of really important points. If we just take the UK context on its own for now, we've got 4 different governments. They all claim to be following the science. Why are they doing such different things?
Well, shall I take that one? I mean,
yeah, please.
I think there are 2 things to say there. The first is, in the run-up to lockdown, I mean, I think that's probably the most profoundly important part of it. The run-up to the lockdown, the 23rd, they all pretty much did and said the same thing up to that point. So they were all kind of following the same information, which was a little bit which was unhelpful, because they locked down too late. But that was, I think, a similar response across all nations. Since then, I think you're starting to see differences in the timing of the relaxation of lockdowns and a difference in the language they use to do it. But I don't think. Oh, there goes my door. Yeah. I don't think that they've done things that differently. I think they've used the same information, and it's been very much about the description and the timing of what's going on that's really mattered.
Thank you. Lucia, we'll come to you next to cover some more about this topic of how could we do things better and where do universities fit into it all?
Thank you. I think a lot of Paul's work has helped me understand a lot of times the way policy issues are raised and framed is really important. Paul refers to a competition for ideas. And taking Agnes's points on board, and with South African colleagues, thinking about an equity focus, we often think about, well, whose voices count in these situations, and that, as I described, really led us to a decentralised, data-driven approach. But it's not just that. Working in South Africa has taught me that working to combine top-down direction with bottom-up innovation, insight and energy perhaps is a useful way to go. And that brings me back to the point of evidence and how evidence is generated. I think while good and thorough analysis is of course important, research is often extremely slow. It's not unusual to take years from collection of data to publication of results. And that is simply not fit for purpose, where data interventions and communications of interventions need to happen in a matter of days in our new normal. So I think we need that combination of the top down and bottom up. We need agile and embedded research to support local decision making in real time. But strategically, to gain traction at higher levels, I think we need tools to deal with those higher levels of power that are often dominated by business and the corporate sector.
Thank you. And how do you see that playing in the context of COVID? Where are you seeing what I take to be excessive influence by business and the corporate sector? Lucia?
Well, I think we're seeing some troubling shifts in England. I don't think we're necessarily entirely the same in Scotland, but certainly in England, there seems to be a lot of commercial activity around testing, tracing, perhaps not so much isolation, but certainly those activities, and a withholding of data on notifiable events. COVID became a notifiable event in this country in March. However, private organisations who are collecting data, which is of course reasonable, but however are not sharing that information locally, again for local planning. We've had a serious outbreak in one part of our country, and public health directors in that location, again, were in the dark. So I find that quite a difficult thing to understand.
I think that's a really important point, that we can't have evidence-based policymaking if policymakers, or indeed local policymakers in the case you're referring to, can't get access to the evidence that would help them to prepare and implement policies successfully. Paul and Agnes, do you want to add anything else to this topic before we move on?
Yes. I would like also that I didn't understand, Paul, what you say about we should not only take scientific research, because what is done at community and even the traditional knowledge, all this for me is if we put a good system to understand it and use a method, it's scientific information. All this is scientific information. And when I say making people accountable, who are those people who bypass regulation to share data? I'm sorry, there is accountability to just notice that is not enough. The people have the right to be protected. And those people who doesn't share data should go and sleep in jail. That's my point of view, because they did that by purpose. So that means the accountability system doesn't follow the democratic vision of the right of people.
So shall I just, I think on the scientific point, I think what we probably should have done at the start was come up with a list of definitions, shouldn't we? Because I think
Yeah.
I think, particularly in the UK, I think when people describe scientific information, they have a very narrow range of subjects in mind that doesn't include, wider sources of knowledge. So, right or wrong, I think if I was to describe scientific information, and maybe it'd be in quotation marks, to demonstrate that a lot of people think of science as, in relation to a very narrow set of methods. Okay, so if we were to say that scientific information is actually a collection of many sources of knowledge from many people, then good. I mean, I think that's a good political point to make, I think. In terms of information sharing, I mean, the only thing I would say is there have been these operational issues that come up, and there are these problems with people not sharing information for intellectual or commercial reasons. I mean, I think often universities will not share information because they want to publish first as well. I don't think it's just private sector. But I think the problem that's come up with COVID has been this debate about should track and trace type systems be centralized or decentralized. And I think my impression is that the decentralized argument is winning. It's certainly in Germany, they appear to have given up on a centralized model, and I think in the UK they gave up on it, and partly because of the sense that the centre would be retaining too much information. That would be brilliant for researchers and for rapid response, but not brilliant for a sense of public trust in who keeps your information and how long they use it and such like. So I would say that type of issue is still kind of unresolved during the crisis.
Okay, thanks to all of you. We've covered our first two questions of what's the record like in different parts of the world on evidence-based policymaking, and then secondly, how could we contribute through universities and through other organisations to make this work a bit better. We've got one final section in our discussion, which is to consider some questions that have been submitted by members of the community here at Aberdeen and elsewhere, and we'll take those in sequence. So we have three in particular to look at. And the first one is, how are universities engaging with Ministries of Health and other relevant health organisations in following the science? Agnes, would you like to take that one first, please? You're muted.
Sorry. So the question is how a university can link with the decision makers to improve health outcome. So that means universities are full of researchers. And I think our job is also to be at service of the population, meaning we can identify what are the needed, the gaps in knowledge now for the politician to do the right thing. Like now, we are all going to go slowly in stopping the lockdown, resume flight and everything. How to do, that's like a question of research. How to do that without harming locally. It's not the same here than in UK, than in Scotland, than elsewhere. So we need to customize our work to serve the people by helping the politician to have the information to take the best decision. And also when we talk about, we should stand drastically on the value of the traditional knowledge or the community knowledge, because many things has failed in this pandemic management because people didn't follow it, people didn't trust, people didn't understand what we were saying. And can say things one the other day they said the other thing. They did political statement about a pandemic more than a scientific statement about how to manage it. How can we change that? And this is our role. And I have to say that unfortunately, since even Ebola, since even long time ago, many universities have did research, lot of publication, but keep that if they are not used, it's okay. No, you make sure that the knowledge you generate is used so that we can save more life.
Thank you. Lucia, would you like to take this one next, please?
Do you mean to follow on?
Still on the first question on engaging with Ministries of Health?
I very much agree. I read a statement on Twitter by the editor of BMJ Global Health, Sei Ambimbola. He was talking last week about how many authors don't realise the reason why they're writing papers. I think that reflects some of what Agnes was saying. I think we could do a better job in universities of incentivising. I think we've made important shifts in recent years, but I think we could do more about incentivising those connections and relationships. This is beyond dissemination. This is about working relationships. And as Paul was describing, those policy circles that make significant inputs to how policy is made.
Thank you. That's raising a wider set of questions, which I'm going to ask Paul to say something about, which is incentives for academics to engage with the policy process and to attempt to influence policy decisions. How are you seeing that?
Well, I mean, I suppose there's two parallel tracks here, you know, the kind of more general one and the COVID one. I mean, so if I describe the sort of engagement with universities during the crisis, I would say, you know, there are these different phases. The first is you've got sort of high status professors in some universities who are part of advisory groups that have a direct engagement with government. And I think that has been a really important function. It's been a kind of narrow pool of recruitment, but it's been a very regular and responsive process. And then it's been followed by identifying research questions that universities can help answer. So, I mean, just going through the stage minutes and papers, you know, they kind of we're gearing up to the big one, which is the immunology, and you know, if someone has had COVID, will they be immune the next time, that sort of thing. So, I mean, it's a little bit worrying reading that stuff, but you know, people are still not sure if about key things, how long are people infectious, and how far can droplets carry, and that sort of thing. So there's clearly a role for universities in responding to calls from research funders to fill those gaps. And you've seen a kind of remarkably quick process, at least in the UK, where they put out a call for research funding and funded a huge number of projects. That's kind of good responsive stuff. In terms of the more incentives more generally, I think certainly I've grown up in my career knowing that the first thing someone will do when they look at your CV is look at your publications and where they are. And it's been very recently they'll look for indicators of impact that are tangible. And even then, I think it's not a universal drive towards impact. It's a concentrated one and a small group of people who can demonstrate it to such a high extent that it's worth writing about in a case study or something like that. So with colleagues, we've been doing some research on research engagement type initiatives, and what they're for, and I can share that with you later. I don't want to summarize it too much, but even then, when government bodies and research councils fund that kind of engagement, it's quite difficult to know what they want them to do or what output they expect from it. It's going to impact in a general sense, but they're not sure if it's to help governments solve the policy problems they raise, or if it's to do something else, help the careers of early career researchers, or encourage equity amongst researchers or social groups. I mean, I think right now it has been, research should help us solve an urgent problem as identified by government. But more generally, I think that's not as clear.
Okay, thank you all. We have a second question that's come in, which refers not to policymakers or researchers or academics, but to the student community and what role they might play in forging student-led alliances in COVID research. Lucia?
So for the last few years in the School of Medicine, we've been taking a slightly different approach to teaching. We've been progressing something we call work-based learning, whereby we directly connect trainees or students with a range of organisations, NGOs, service providers, international research groups, to actively put classroom teaching into action in student-led projects. And we find this transforms learning. It provides important professional and networking experiences, and it's quite a positive way for those undergoing training to engage, to gain hands-on experience with different groups, including policy groups, to gain that wider sense of the sort of ecology of evidence and policy and understand the entire environment, perhaps as they train to operate in it.
Thank you. Agnes, how does this work in your university?
So in our university, I think there is a community college where each student have to contribute in ideas, research, and also practice to raise the wellness of the community surrounding us and the the country if possible. But also for the medical education, it's 6 years, and it's also unaffordable for the majority of African students, not for the other students. So what we have made the medical education free for all at one condition: to serve during 6 to 9 years, it depends, a committee will judge, at the service. They keep their entire salary, but they will work in a place where the world needs them. It can be with street destitute people in European countries or US. It can be among the Aborigines in Australia. It can be among the remote district in Rwanda. They keep their salary. They can even earn tons of money, but they turn their knowledge in service during 9 to 6 years. 6 years when it's a very hard place, like I can take a refugee camp in South Sudan. Second, we want them to put their practicum around solving a problem of a destitute community. Like an example, there are 2 students doing assessing COVID knowledge and attitude that affect mental health among students in Rwanda. There is also knowledge and practice around COVID in refugee camp to see what we can do. So students can contribute. We doesn't have to forget that the work they do to get their degree is in money invested for the wellness of the population, that they should turn in knowledge that can help the population as much as the knowledge they receive. So there is, those are 3 examples, but I can go on and go on.
Thank you. Lucia, you wanted to add something?
Thank you. That makes me think of your last remarks, Paul. I wonder if you might share with us any views you have on students and other researchers investigating questions that perhaps aren't mandated from the government, I mean.
Okay, so I mean, I was going to say, so I run a master's in public policy, and I think when I started teaching, it would be a kind of traditional format, which was, you know, policy process is really complicated, write me an essay, 10 pages, you know. Whereas now it's, you know, the world is very complicated, but, you know, we really need to change it. So write me a 1-page policy analysis and make it feasible. And I think the thing that I suppose you might struggle with during that process is to balance 2 different things. You know, one is a sense of pragmatism, where almost all of the policy analysis type advice is to be pragmatic, think of who your client is and frame things in terms of your client, and that really sets boundaries on what you can say or how much you can challenge. And that's good advice for a career. But it's not good advice for people who are dissatisfied with their clients and dissatisfied with the world around them and they want to change it. And I don't have an answer for that one. Usually I kind of eke that one out and then the course is finished. You know, we don't quite get to it. But I think there's a tension there about the training we give to students in terms of how to improve their careers, and the training that we might give them to facilitate a more equitable world. And I think, you know, there's still some of that is kind of unresolved for me.
Thanks to all 3 of you. We have one final question to look at, and that is, how can universities in both the global south and north promote more equitable research alliances? Agnes.
I think that, this is a great question because the problem is, in fact, the money for research are in the north. And there is all a setting to do a lot of research in the south. So, and majority of research are not necessarily set up agenda by the researcher in the north. They are set up by those who give the money. So if we could partner together to change the way the money is given, so that there is a respect of researchers both sides, and we go together for research that help the community where we live in. I'm part of, like for COVID, we need to have a solution. If I'm doing a research, it's not going to be for Rwanda, because what the hell is useful to have a solution for here, because it will not last. We need solution that is applicable to many parts of the world. We need to go together for such an approach. Second, the ownership of the research should be really co-owned. And also, because the way to do research in this part of the world where I am is far low, the capacity to do. No research should not go with capacity to do a series of people in this part of the world and drag them. And publication. And the other thing is, you tackle this, it was tackled before, is the more you publish in prestigious journal, the more you are known. Even if your publication is save no life. We should have another index about impact in saving life and healthy. That's how we start. Not what is there. And you know, it's like an imperialism, and it is like a dictatorship. What is there now? I can do a research with one district here and contribute to change the world, and another one, just because he's known, is publishing in Nature or somewhere else, he will be blessed and known and renowned. We have to change that and put the science at the right place. So put the science at the right place, change the norms of award, bring research that is mutually benefiting, and recognize the right of the both sides, and it will work.
Thank you. Paul.
Well, that's good. I don't want to have the last word on this because I think I'm conscious I kind of symbolize the problem. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem is this dominance of white male professors in Western countries, right? So, but I think I came up with the same recommendations nonetheless. So I think I would put them down to 3. So, you know, don't assume that the same principles and practices of research apply universally. And I think that really means don't assume that whatever works in the UK or the West, you know, should be applied across the world. Address the impact of the rules of research or the gatekeeping on researcher status. So I think that put as bluntly, it would be the rules you have about good research privilege people in the North and exclude people from the South. And, you know, acceptance rates and memberships of editorial boards are kind of biased against people in the South. The final thing, I guess, is, you know, don't treat research in each country like a temporary visit, you know, because that is kind of characteristic of a lot of, you know, say UK researchers. They'll go to African states and do a little bit of research and then go home and write about it and forget about it, you know. So instead, you know, develop partnerships built on mutual status and respect, and treat them as for the long term rather than as for, you know, instrumental ticks on the CV.
Thank you. And Lucia?
Not much to add from this side, except I keep thinking of the phrase, we blame society, but we are society. I think researchers, academics have an important role to challenge these systems and hierarchies that can be exploitative. And it's about values, it's about inclusion and equity, and acknowledge the need to reconfigure those systems.
Thank you very much to all of you. We started off with quite a simple question, which, what does it mean to be following the science? And between your comments and observations and analysis, I think we've seen that this is in fact much more complex than that simple question would suggest. First of all, because there isn't a single science for anyone to be following. There are multiple pieces of scientific evidence that need to be sifted and compared and potentially drawn upon. Secondly, that our governments are working in very different circumstances, as we've heard, in different parts of the world. The histories of government intervention, the problems that governments are trying to deal with make a difference to how that science is used. And then thirdly, governments are trying to pursue different objectives. They have different purposes in drawing upon the circumstance, on the science. They're trying to achieve different things. And the same is true for the public, that the preferences may be different in different places. So all of this is quite messy and complex and non-linear. Nevertheless, you've given us lots of good clues about how we could try to improve it. And I'm sure when the history of the global crisis comes to be written, evidence-based policymaking, or the lack of it, will be right at the heart of the narratives which are being produced. Let's hope, though, that the crisis itself is dealt with effectively as quickly as possible, that the evidence, to the extent that it can be used, is applied effectively so we get past the crisis. And then some of our academic colleagues can get on with writing the history. And we as a community with an interest in evidence-based policymaking will be able to move on to a different topic, and one, let's hope, which is less threatening. and less urgent. Thanks very much to all of you. That's been a super discussion. Bye for now.